The wind hit different at 8,000 feet. Jonas Fletcher learned that his first November in the Wind River Valley, 1834, when ice crystals formed on the inside of his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the fireplace. He'd built the cabin the way every trapper in the Rocky Mountains built them. Logs stacked tight, mud packed between the gaps, stone fireplace at one end. Standard construction. Everyone did it that way. By February, he'd burned through more firewood than any 3 men should need for a winter. His hands were raw from splitting logs, his back ached from hauling them, and still the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Worse, when spring finally arrived and the valley warmed, that same cabin turned into an oven. The thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat, making sleep impossible. Jonas wasn't alone in this problem. Every trapper building cabins in the mountains faced the same brutal reality. Summer days could hit 90 degrees, winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both, and traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. What Jonas discovered over the next 3 years would quietly spread through the mountain communities of the Rockies. He didn't invent any of the individual techniques, but he combined them in a specific way that addressed the unique challenges of high-altitude living. The result was a cabin that stayed noticeably warmer in winter and cooler in summer, using less firewood and providing actual comfort in conditions that usually offered none. The story of how he figured it out involves a Swedish trapper, a Shoshone woman who thought white men built ridiculous houses, and Jonas's own stubborn refusal to spend another winter freezing. The first mistake. Jonas Fletcher wasn't anyone special. Born in Virginia in 1809, he'd worked as a carpenter's apprentice before the lure of the fur trade pulled him west. He had some building experience, which was more than most trappers could claim, but he knew timber frames and board construction, not log cabins. The first structure he built in the Wind River Valley reflected that inexperience. He'd picked a good spot, southern exposure for maximum winter sun, a cold spring nearby, timber close enough to haul logs without breaking his back. Every practical consideration checked the right box. But when it came to actually building the cabin, Jonas made every mistake a first-timer could make. He cut his logs in late summer when the sap was still running, didn't season them properly, stacked them with the bark still on because removing it seemed like extra work. Used whatever chinking material was handy, clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded areas, even grass stuffed in the bigger gaps. That cabin taught him lessons the hard way. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. The moss dried out and fell out in chunks. But the worst problem was something Jonas couldn't see or understand at first. The cabin had no thermal mass inside the insulated envelope. The stone fireplace sat against the outer wall, so half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior. On the coldest nights, Jonas could literally watch frost creep across the inside of the walls, despite keeping the fire roaring. Jonas spent that first winter burning 4 cords of wood a month, 3 times what it should have taken. He spent the summer sleeping outside on the ground because the cabin was unbearable. He knew something was fundamentally wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The answers started coming together in the fall of 1835 when a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Niels had been in the mountains since the early 1820s, one of the old-timers who'd seen everything and survived it all. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You're cold here," Niels said. It wasn't a question. Jonas didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight, mostly. Got a good fireplace." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on some of the logs, checked the chinking, looked at how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Jonas had no idea what that meant. Niels explained it in the straightforward way of someone who'd figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline, and the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In the old country," Niels said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air, so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He went on to explain that the best cabins he'd seen in the Rockies positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking, and they built with properly seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and open new gaps. Jonas listened carefully. He'd already started planning his second cabin. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he'd followed before, but that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. That same autumn, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper. They stopped at Jonas's cabin to trade, and Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as the common language of the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." Morning Crow explained that her people didn't build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called 2 skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it didn't move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it couldn't carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides of it was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer through constantly. She described how her people used bark, hides, or woven mats to create double-layer shelters. She explained how they dug lodges partially underground in the coldest regions, using the earth itself as insulation. "In summer," she said, "you want the hot air to leave. Make openings high where the hot air goes. In winter, you close the high openings. Make the hot air stay inside." Jonas spent the rest of that autumn thinking about everything Niels and Morning Crow had told him. By December, he'd worked out a plan for a new cabin. He'd rebuild from scratch, using everything he'd learned. He started cutting logs in late fall when the sap had retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as he'd need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls. He let the logs sit through the winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Jonas's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that kept the bottom logs from ground moisture, provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space, and gave him storage that stayed cool in summer, but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs laid flat side up over thick support beams. The air gap in the crawl space combined with the mass of the wood floor created a thermal buffer that kept the living area noticeably warmer. The second major change involved the walls themselves. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced the prevailing winter winds, Jonas built a second wall, 2 feet inside the main wall. The gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of materials: dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest duff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. For chinking, Jonas developed a specific recipe. The base layer was small split wood pieces wedged tightly into the gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair. He'd traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks. But Jonas added one more element: lime. Mixing a small amount of lime into the clay made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The third major change was the fireplace and chimney. Instead of building against the outer wall, Jonas positioned his fireplace in the interior, about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace. The entire structure probably weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward: fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. Jonas could let the fire die down to coals, or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. The fourth major element addressed ventilation and seasonal adaptation. Jonas built small openings near the roofline on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, these stayed closed with fitted wood plugs sealed with clay. In summer, he removed the plugs, allowing hot air to rise out of the cabin naturally. He also designed the roof differently than standard cabin construction. Jonas built a steeper pitch, which shed snow more effectively, created more insulating air gap between ceiling and roof, and allowed him to add a layer of sod over the split wood shingles. The sod roof was something he'd seen used by settlers on the plains. He laid split cedar shakes as the base layer, then spread several inches of clay over them as a moisture barrier, then added thick soil. Grass and wildflowers grew in this soil, their roots binding it together. The result was a living roof that insulated beautifully and absorbed summer heat before it could penetrate the cabin. The fifth element involved windows and the south wall. Jonas built his cabin with the main door and 2 windows on the south side, facing the winter sun. The windows were small, glass was expensive, but positioned to let in maximum light during the low sun angle of winter. Inside, Jonas positioned stone slabs beneath each window. These slabs absorbed winter sunlight during the day and released that heat through the evening and night. Construction took most of the summer of 1836. Other trappers passing through the valley watched his progress with skepticism. Building with double walls seemed like unnecessary work. The massive interior fireplace looked strange. The sod roof drew particular comments. Most trappers thought it would leak or collapse. Jonas ignored the skeptics and kept working. The first real test came in October when an early cold snap hit the valley, dropping nighttime temperatures below 0. Jonas lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, warm enough that Jonas didn't need his heavy coat, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He let the fire go completely out around midnight and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The real test came in January when temperatures dropped to 30 below for several days running. Jonas ran his fireplace routine, hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening, then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. Jonas burned less than half the firewood he'd used the previous winter, and the cabin stayed dramatically more comfortable. He could work on projects inside without gloves. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. The difference was remarkable enough that other trappers who visited immediately wanted to know what he'd done differently. Word spread through the Wind River Valley and beyond. Other trappers began incorporating Jonas's techniques into their own cabins. Some used the double wall construction. Others focused on repositioning their fireplaces to create interior thermal mass. Most started using his chinking recipe. By 1838, several cabins in the valley featured variations on Jonas's design. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid structure with double walls, only on the north side. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating a stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. The summer benefits became apparent during the hot months of 1837. While other cabins turned into ovens, Jonas's structure stayed noticeably cooler. The sod roof absorbed heat before it could penetrate. The thick walls prevented heat from conducting inward. The high ventilation openings allowed hot air to escape. Jonas discovered he could enhance summer cooling by opening his door early in the morning when the outside air was coolest, letting that cool air flow in. By mid-morning, he'd close everything up, trapping the cool air inside. The thermal mass of the walls and fireplace kept the interior comfortable through the hot afternoon. The techniques Jonas developed weren't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double wall construction, interior thermal mass, proper chinking, all these methods existed in various forms. What Jonas did was combine them specifically for the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain living. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin didn't have to be just a box made of logs. It could be designed to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to adapt to seasonal changes. By the early 1840s, as the beaver trade collapsed and many trappers left the mountains, the knowledge of building climate-adapted cabins had spread throughout the Rocky Mountain communities. Settlers arriving in the region found trappers' cabins with these features already incorporated, and they adopted the techniques for their own construction. Jonas Fletcher stayed in the Wind River Valley until 1843. He eventually married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin, and they raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. The cabin itself stood for over 40 years, surviving countless winter storms and summer heat waves. Better insulated cabins required less firewood, which meant less time spent in dangerous, exhausting work. This gave trappers and settlers more time for other activities. Reduced firewood use also meant less impact on local forests. Warmer, more comfortable cabins contributed to better health outcomes. Constant exposure to cold stressed the body and increased vulnerability to illness. The social aspect of Jonas's innovations deserves mention too. By sharing his techniques freely with other trappers and settlers, he contributed to a tradition of mutual aid that characterized mountain communities. Building a cabin that worked properly meant the difference between surviving winter and freezing to death. People shared survival knowledge because everyone's life depended on it. The story of Jonas Fletcher's cabin illustrates something important about innovation in frontier settings. Major breakthroughs didn't always come from professional builders or trained engineers. Sometimes the most valuable innovations came from observant people, willing to learn from mistakes, listen to diverse knowledge sources, and experiment until they found better solutions. Jonas's combination of Swedish log-building principles, indigenous construction knowledge, and practical carpentry created something more effective than any single tradition alone. The fundamental lesson from Jonas Fletcher's work, that buildings can be designed to work with climate rather than simply resist it, remains relevant. Modern green building and passive house design follow similar principles. Use thermal mass to store and release heat strategically. Create insulated envelopes to prevent heat transfer. Design for natural ventilation. Orient structures to take advantage of passive solar heating. These aren't new ideas. Mountain men in the 1830s understood these principles, even if they expressed them differently than modern engineers. Jonas died in 1881 at the age of 72. Having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era, he'd seen the beaver trade boom and collapse, witnessed the transformation of the mountain wilderness into settled territory. Through all those changes, he remembered those early winters in the Wind River Valley, learning the hard way how to build a cabin that actually worked. The cabin that started it all, that carefully built structure with its double walls and massive stone fireplace, is long gone. Only the stone fireplace remained standing into the early 1900s, before eventually being buried by shifting soil and growing vegetation. But the knowledge it represented survived. It moved through the trapper community, influenced settler construction, persisted in vernacular building traditions, and eventually reconnected with formal architectural principles. Jonas Fletcher would probably be surprised to learn that his building techniques would be remembered nearly 2 centuries later. He was just trying to stay warm, to make his life a little more comfortable in a harsh environment. But in solving that personal problem, he contributed to a body of knowledge that helped countless others facing similar challenges. That's the nature of practical innovation on the frontier. Individuals solving immediate problems, sharing solutions, and collectively developing knowledge that makes survival not just possible, but sustainable.